stop to really think about why you end up desiring who you desire? Or, why you identify as the gender you do? It might feel like the most, natural thing in the world, but what if it's maybe not quite so straightforward?
Yeah, it's a deep question.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're really going to try and explore this fascinating idea that gender and desire aren't just suppressed by society's rules, but that these rules, these prohibitions, actually play a huge role in producing them, in creating them.
Right, not just blocking, but building. We'll be looking at some, pretty mind-bending ideas from thinkers like Foucault and Judith Butler.
And dipping into psychoanalysis, even anthropology, to see how these frameworks kind of intersect.
And central to this is the concept of the heterosexual matrix.
Okay, what exactly is that? Break it down.
Think of it as the underlying grid or framework.
Yeah.
The societal assumption that there are two distinct genders, male and female, and that the normal or default desire is between them.
So the kind of unwritten rule book.
Exactly. The one that makes binary gender and heterosexuality seem like the obvious baseline. And we're going to unpack how that rule book gets written.
Right. Because it's not just about the don'ts, like the incest taboo or the historical taboo against homosexuality. We're exploring the argument that these very prohibitions have a productive power, a creative force.
It's a counterintuitive idea, isn't it? That saying no can actually generate something specific.
Totally. So it's not just what they forbid, but what they actively create in terms of gender categories and patterns of desire. Hopefully by the end of this, listeners might see some of these seemingly natural parts of identity in a, completely different light.
Yeah, maybe some aha moments that challenge common assumptions. It asks you to consider, what if those desires aren't just innate things waiting to be freed or repressed?
What if the rules themselves shape the desire?
Precisely. What if the act of prohibition itself guides and maybe even generates the desire along certain paths?
Okay, that leads us straight into Foucault's challenge to what he called the repressive hypothesis.
Right, the old idea.
Yeah, the common wisdom for ages was basically there's this raw, natural energy or desire. Foucault used the term jouissance, kind of like pure, untamed drive. And society, the law, its job is just to keep that powerful force in check, repress it.
But Foucault completely flipped that. He argued the law isn't just negative. It's not just a big NO.
Productive.
Exactly. Productive. It doesn't just block or channel pre-existing desire. It actively generates the very forms of desire it then claims to regulate or repress.
Whoa. Okay, so the whole notion of repressed desire, this feeling that we have these powerful urges constantly being held back.
Yeah.
Foucault suggested that idea itself is a creation of the law.
Right. It's like a story the law tells about itself, a linguistic fiction almost, that actually amplifies the law's power and makes it seem necessary.
By inventing the thing it needs to control.
You got it. The concept of repression gives the law its justification, its field of operation.
Okay, so how does Judith Butler pick up this Foucauldian thread and apply it specifically to psychoanalysis and the origins of desire?
This is where it gets really fascinating. Butler uses this Foucauldian lens power as productive to reread psychoanalytic theory, especially Freud.
So challenging Freud's ideas.
Well, reinterpreting them. The traditional psychoanalytic take might suggest we have these primary, maybe innate heterosexual or perhaps even bisexual dispositions.
It's just our default factory settings.
Sort of. But Butler suggests maybe these aren't pre-cultural givens at all. Maybe they're actually the effects of prohibitions we internalize very early on.
Effects of the rules. Like the incest taboo.
Exactly like the incest taboo. That's a key example. The standard view is the taboo exists to repress pre-existing incestuous desires.
Right. Keep families from imploding.
Sure, but Butler, looking through Foucault, argues the taboo isn't just stopping something. It's actively constructing desire. It helps create the parent as a prohibited object, generating desire for that object precisely because it's prohibited. And then crucially, it directs or displaces that desire outward, ideally onto a socially acceptable, non-familial opposite-sex object, thus constructing heterosexuality as the outcome.
So the law isn't just saying don't, it's subtly pushing us towards do this instead.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
And this reframes how we see different sexual orientations too. The distinction often made between a primary heterosexual disposition and a secondary homosexual one might not be about inherent nature, but rather a product of this legal and cultural system. A way of sorting desires into legitimate heterosexuality and illegitimate homosexuality.
Okay, let's dive deeper into that specific taboo, the incest taboo. How does it function as this foundational law for the heterosexual matrix?
Well, the sources really emphasize its role as a cornerstone.
Mm.
It's presented as key in building this whole system. Two distinct genders, attraction between them as the norm.
Anthropology comes in here.
Right, particularly structuralist anthropology, like Levi-Strauss.
Okay, Levi-Strauss. Looking for the hidden cultural structures?
Exactly. He saw the incest taboo not just as a psychological thing, but as a fundamental social rule. It regulates the exchange of women between different kinship groups, families, clans.
An exchange of women. That sounds a bit transactional.
It is in
Yeah.
that framework.
Yeah.
The idea is that for societies to form alliances and reproduce themselves culturally, men from one group need to marry women from another group.
Which automatically assumes.
It inherently presupposes exogamous marrying outside the group heterosexuality. It's built right into the structure of kinship, according to Levi-Strauss. It's how alliances are formed, how culture continues.
And Butler connects this directly to the idea that heterosexuality isn't just an option, but it's kind of required, compulsory.
Precisely. Butler argues these kinship systems, founded on the incest taboo and this exchange structure, aren't neutral. They actively reinforce heterosexuality as the necessary, the compulsory basis for social organization and reproduction. It becomes the unspoken law of kinship.
Okay, now what about the other big taboo, mentioned the taboo against homosexuality? How does that fit into producing gender and desire?
What's really interesting is the suggestion that the incest taboo often implicitly requires a taboo against homosexuality to even function in the way Levi-Strauss described.
How so?
Well, if the primary point, socially, is to direct desire outside the family towards an opposite-sex partner for procreation and alliance building.
Then same-sex desire doesn't fit that model.
Exactly. It disrupts the logic of that exchange system. So the taboo against homosexuality acts like an underlying reinforcement, making the incest taboo work towards its heterosexual goal.
So it's not just suppressing homosexuality, it's doing something else too.
Right, like the incest taboo, it's argued to be productive. It actively works to establish heterosexuality as the dominant, the unquestioned norm. And crucially, it helps create the very idea of a rigid binary gender system, distinct opposite males and females.
Because that binary supports heterosexuality.
That's the idea. For heterosexuality to be the clear norm, you need clearly defined opposites. So the prohibition on homosexuality helps shore up the gender binary itself.
And to even define heterosexuality clearly, you almost need to invent homosexuality as the thing it's not.
That's a key part of the argument. Homosexuality has to be produced as an intelligible category, something identifiable so that it can be prohibited. And in prohibiting it, heterosexuality gets solidified as the standard, the default.
Wow, okay. This is definitely challenging the born this way narrative for, well, everything. Now, the sources bring in melancholia. That sounds heavy. How does melancholia relate to forming gender identity?
It does sound heavy, but it's a really insightful psychoanalytic concept applied here. Freud originally described melancholia as a pathological response to loss, where instead of grieving and letting go, you unconsciously incorporate the lost loved object into your own ego.
So the lost person kind of becomes part of you in a way that's not fully processed.
Right. And the argument here extends that. Gender identification itself could be seen as a form of melancholia. It's about the loss, or rather the prohibition, of certain kinds of attachments.
Forbidden attachment.
Yes. Specifically, the potential for same-sex attachments that are foreclosed by the societal taboos we've been discussing. The idea is that you internalize the prohibition, the no, directed at, say, a same-sex parent.
Okay.
And that internalization, that taking in of the prohibition associated with the desired but forbidden person of the same sex, helps to consolidate your own gender identity as aligned with that sex while directing desire towards the opposite sex.
Can you give an example? That's a bit abstract.
Sure. Freud's example is often cited. A young boy deals with his attachment to his father, which might have homosexual dimensions, by identifying with him. He takes the father in, symbolically.
Okay.
This identification helps solidify his masculine identity, partly as a defense against the prohibited homosexual desire, and it redirects his desire towards the mother, or women more generally.
So identifying as a man becomes a way to manage the forbidden desire for a man.
That's the psychoanalytic argument being explored, and it leads to a really provocative thought, that perhaps the more rigidly and stably someone holds onto their gender identity, the less resolved that initial unconscious loss or foreclosure might be. The firm boundaries might be protecting against an unacknowledged grief or prohibition.
That is provocative. It flips the usual thinking. Now, there's also this distinction between incorporation and interjection.
Right.
What's that about?
Right. Building on Freud, theorists like Abraham and Torok elaborated this. Interjection is seen as the healthier process in mourning. You acknowledge the loss, you grieve, you symbolically take in positive aspects or memories, but the person remains distinct.
So integrated accepted loss.
Yes. Incorporation, linked more to melancholia, is described as more magical, more literal. You refuse to acknowledge the loss on some level. You unconsciously preserve the lost object inside the body, almost like swallowing it whole, to deny its absence.
Keeping it alive inside, but in a sort of frozen way?
Kind of. It's a refusal to mourn, a psychic preservation. And how does this relate to gender? The idea is that this melancholic gender formation often involves incorporation. The loss related to the foreclosed homosexual attachment isn't mourned and integrated, it's incorporated. It gets written onto or into the body itself.
Making the body seem like it naturally is that gender.
Exactly. It makes the body appear to bear sex as its literal, undeniable truth. The prohibited desire is sort of solidified as gender identity, located on the body.
And this might even shape our physical sensations, like pleasure zones.
That's part of the speculation. The way pleasure gets localized in certain erotogenic zones and tabooed in others could be seen as fallout from this gender-differentiating melancholy. The body becomes the map of these unresolved losses and prohibitions.
This whole discussion really hammers away at the idea of any fixed pre-cultural origin for gender or sexuality.
Absolutely. It's a direct critique of what's called foundationalism, the belief in some essential sex or sexuality existing before culture intervenes. Think about the idea of the biological female body as just raw material for culture to shape into a woman.
Nature versus nurture again, kind of.
But it goes deeper. The argument is that even the category of biological sex, the seemingly neutral matter, is itself a discursive formation. It's a concept produced through language and scientific discourse that often serves to uphold existing power structures, like patriarchy.
So even the nature side is already shaped by culture and power.
That's the radical critique.
Yeah.
And it applies to those dispositions, too. The sexual urges we think are just innate. They might actually be the result of culturally imposed prohibitions we've internalized, not some bedrock biological fact.
What about something like bisexuality? Does that escape this matrix?
Well, even concepts like bisexuality, which might seem to exist outside the strict binary, are still understood and articulated within our existing cultural and linguistic frameworks. They are still constructions within discourse. The idea of something being truly outside culture, yet understandable by culture, is seen as problematic.
So the feeling that gender and heterosexuality are just natural is really an effect, something constantly being produced.
Exactly. It's an ongoing effect of these cultural norms, legal prohibitions, and psychic processes, constantly working to make themselves seem natural and inevitable.
Which brings us back, full circle almost, to power. Not just power saying no, but power actively creating these categories.
That's the crucial Foucauldian point that Butler runs with. Power is fundamentally productive when it comes to sexuality. Law, prohibition, the incest taboo, the taboo against homosexuality, they don't just restrict. They actively create the categories of legitimate and illegitimate desire, shaping the very field of sexuality.
So that paradox again. The incest taboo might not just forbid desire for the parent, but could actually help generate and sustain that desire precisely through prohibition.
That's the challenging idea, and it connects back to homosexuality needing to be produced as an intelligible, prohibitable category for heterosexuality to reign as the norm.
You need the other to define the self, or the norm in this case.
In a sense, yes. The prohibition helps delineate and solidify the boundaries of what is considered acceptable and natural.
Okay, but if these categories are constructed, produced by these forces, are they stable? Or are there, like, cracks, possibilities for subversion?
Definitely. The sources suggest an inherent instability. These categories created through prohibition aren't seamless. There's mention of an underlying psychic doubleness or inherent bisexuality, a potential within us that resists being neatly sorted into binary boxes.
So maybe we're not as easily categorized as the rules suggest.
Perhaps not deep down. And then there's the concept of masquerade, especially discussed in relation to femininity by thinkers like Riviere and Lacan.
Masquerade, like putting on a performance.
Exactly. The idea that gender, particularly femininity in some theories, it's an appearance, a mask. This very performance can inadvertently reveal that there isn't necessarily a fixed essential gender identity underneath. It highlights the constructedness.
Like acting the part so well, it shows it's just a part.
Kind of. And sometimes the attempt to perfectly embody the impossible ideals of man or woman being or having, the phallus in Lacanian psychoanalytic terms, can lead to, well, failures or inconsistencies. These moments can unintentionally expose the artificiality of the whole structure.
Right. Okay. Let's try to wrap our heads around the main point here. What's the core takeaway from this deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaway is that things we often perceive as the most natural, innate parts of ourselves, our gender identity, who we desire, are actually profoundly shaped, maybe even produced, by societal laws, cultural norms, taboos, and these complex psychological mechanisms like prohibition and melancholia.
So the productive power of these often invisible forces is much stronger than we think.
Much stronger. It challenges the idea that these things are simply given.
So if our desires and identities are so deeply influenced by these structures, what does that really mean for how we understand ourselves and others? And maybe how does recognizing this open up new possibilities?
That's the crucial question to ponder, isn't it? Recognizing the constructed nature of these norms, particularly the heterosexual matrix, can have real political implications. It might help destabilize the idea that heterosexuality is compulsory or that gender must be binary.
Making space for other ways of being.
Exactly. It potentially opens up space to validate a wider spectrum of sexualities and gender identities that don't fit neatly into the traditional boxes. It challenges the foundations of those boxes themselves.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for breaking all that down.
It's complex stuff, but fascinating to think about.
Okay, let's let that sink in.